Okay, so we'll just do a land acknowledgement before we start. We acknowledge the traditional territory upon which the conference is being hosted. For many thousands of years, the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit have sought to walk gently on this land. This territory is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. This acknowledgement signals our desire to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on honor and deep respect, and is a starting point to remind us all to enact this work in our personal and professional lives. I'd like to thank our Zoom host today, Ashley Sikorsky. So thank you for everything you've done so far and for helping make this session run smoothly. I am also honored to introduce Dr. Marc Cadotte and Dr. Stuart Livingstone, our presenters today. Dr. Cadotte is a professor at U of T Scarborough, where he has been teaching and conducting research since 2009. He is the editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Ecological Solutions and Evidence, and has over 200 scientific publications on a range of ecology and conservation topics. Dr. Livingstone received his PhD from the Department of Physical and Environmental Studies at U of T Scarborough. You weren't colleagues at the time, I guess. He has published extensively on a variety of conservation and ecology subjects. He currently holds a lecturer position at U of T Scarborough and is a postdoctoral researcher at U of T. So with that, I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for the introduction. And thanks very much to the conference organizers for putting this great program together as well. So Marc and I would like to talk to you about the communication of biodiversity and conservation in urban environments. And our Twitter handles are there. If you'd like to follow up after the conversation, we'd be happy to have any, follow up on any content related to what we're talking about after the fact. Okay, so here's an outline of what we'd like to be talking to you about. So first of all, we'd like to get a sense of who you are through a Mentimeter survey. We'll explain that if you're not familiar with it. Second, Marc will talk to you about the nature of urban ecosystems, and then I'll explore some pedagogical approaches for the communication of urban biodiversity and conservation. Okay, so just to start things off, nice and easy, getting to know who you are. So we're going to do a Mentimeter survey here. So this is pre-arranged. If you go to menti.com, either in one of your browser tabs or on your mobile device, and you can use that code there. And we have some questions just to, get a sense of where you work and what your experiences have been with urban environments and biodiversity broadly. And then we can look at those responses as you put them in. So here we go. Hopefully you can see that in real time. Marc, do you want to walk them through this part and talk about it?
Sure, thanks, Stu. And thanks everyone for coming and also participating in this survey. We just want to get a sense of where people are coming from. And so what you see is actually phenomenally surprising, which is a fairly even spread across different sectors where people are dealing with environmental education and pedagogy. And someone's saying in the chat, it's tough to pick just one. I suspect people have multiple affiliations and can probably tick off a couple of boxes. All right, maybe we'll give it a few more seconds, right, Stu?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good distribution there.
Oh, that's great. So yeah, we have people from private industry, NGOs, government, K-12 education, university sectors.
Okay, should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the next one is about the type of position you're in. So we talked about the employer, but now we want to know exactly what you're doing. And the reason why we're asking you guys these questions is it's important for us to get a sense of who we're talking to. Certainly it will shape a little bit of what I say as I go through my slides, and probably Stuart as well. But given that the audience is obviously diverse, we'll probably keep it as general as possible and as accessible as possible. So we've got half the people are teachers. And I think that's almost everyone. 21 people.
Okay. Oh, researcher. There we go.
Well, we got one researcher. Okay.
Okay. Should we move on to the next one?
Yep.
Okay.
Now we want to get a sense of people's environmental or ecological engagement, how much they interact with nature. So the first question on this front is where people grew up. What was your immediate surroundings as you grew up?
A lot of burbs. Okay, I think that's everyone.
Yeah.
So, a couple more there.
So highly peri-urban is our audience. Good.
Okay, we'll move on.
And the last one is how frequently you engage with nature. I suspected we would have a non-random audience here. The problem with seeing this live is it's going to bias the future answers, because then you won't want to be the one that sticks out with none.
That's true. That's true.
But yeah, we have quite a environmentally engaged audience. So from the suburbs and interacting with nature on quite a regular basis.
Yeah. Okay. I think that was the last one. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I'll stop sharing and Marc's gonna take over here.
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen now. And you can see that, Stu?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I have a little bit of a picture of the audience here today. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about our understanding of the nature of urban ecosystems. So while we may not think about cities in this way, they are a fundamentally important ecosystem on Earth. They're a new ecosystem that's emerged really in the last few hundred years. And they represent a fundamental transformation of natural, physical, and ecological processes that occur in a single place. They are massive transformations of the flow of energy, of the types of species and nature that can exist in those places, and they're strong concentrations of human impact. Cities are now a dominant feature on Earth. They have grown extensively. In the past 50 years or so, we've seen a switch from the majority of human populations living in and working in rural settings, and now the majority of people on Earth live and work in urban settings. And not only is the actual area dedicated to urbanization increasing and a dominant feature on Earth, but much more importantly is the areas that are needed to support cities. So through resources and energy, we transform large parts of planet Earth in order to support cities. So the effect of cities, while they might seem really localized, are in fact quite widespread. And a city like Toronto, if you think about a city like Toronto, its resource requirements are using land and engaging with economies around the world. But even though cities, we have a mental image of what cities are, cities are actually quite diverse and heterogeneous. And so we might think of cities as being this dense built up area that we see in this first panel here. The reality is that cities come in all different shapes and sizes. And even within cities, we see quite a diversity of form and structure and function. And so the experience that people have with nature in cities differs quite a bit across a city. So for example, if you're the royals living in Kensington Palace, you might have a lot of access to nature in terms of trees, vegetation, water features. But if you're living in an informal settlement on the edge of Rio de Janeiro, you have a very different interaction with nature around you, your access to green space. And this not only is reflected in people's experiences with nature, but also is reflected in the types of nature that persist in cities. And so because of this heterogeneity, because of this diversity across a city, we often see these gradients in terms of the impacts that humans have on the environment, as well as the stressors that are realized. So if you look at this schematic down here, you can see that in the core of cities, we often see these concentrations of human impact. We see a lot of light pollution, sound pollution, air pollution, physical disturbance of habitats. And as we move outside of a city, we might see a decrease in some of those stressors, but we might also see increases in other stressors. You might see accumulations, for example, of water pollution and application of pesticides and fertilizers. But as we look across the city, we also realize that the prevalence and access to green space tends to be very concentrated. And so I show 5 photos here of different cities around the world. And one thing that you should appreciate is that they all have a large bit of green space. However, on all these cases, green space exists in places where it might be difficult or inconvenient to build. So one of the general laws of urban development and green space is that if a city is built in and around steep hills or mountains, that's where the green space will be. And this is important because this means the green space is really non-random with respect to the previous vegetation habitat types that were there, and also mean that in many cases, these green spaces are not that accessible. They're difficult to get to, they're difficult to explore, and not the whole population can traverse across these green spaces. And in cities, it's obvious that, that many species are impacted by urbanization, some positively, many negatively. And this is important because our experience of nature in cities is shaped by those species that can persist and that do well in cities. It's not shaped by the species that are missing. And as we look across urbanization gradients, we see that some species are really heavily impacted by urbanization. So for example, if we look at the number of species for birds, we see these very stark declines in the numbers of species as we increase urbanization, right? For mammals, sometimes the picture is a little more complicated. So we do often see high concentrations of mammals in suburban areas, but when we get to higher urbanization, we see decreases in mammals. We see decreases in some insect and arthropod species, especially butterflies and beetles across urbanization, while other species like bees and spiders may be less affected. Plants introduce the most interesting case, which is that we might not see declines in plant diversity across urbanization gradients, even though we see declines in the amount of vegetated space. And the reason is that humans introduce a lot of non-native plants into urbanized areas through gardening activities, through horticulture. And so we see these high diversity of plant species, but by and large, a lot of that plant diversity we see in cities is non-native exotics. And we do see stark declines in the diversity of native species. And so this also means then that cities, while having this really unique flora, also tend to be places that are concentrations for the the emergence and spread of potential invasive species. Cities are also places where the benefits that we derive from nature are extremely important, right? A city without nature tends to have very poor environmental quality and tends to diminish the well-being of people that live in those places. So from nature, we derive a number of what we call ecosystem services or benefits from nature, which include everything from cultural benefits like recreation and education and learning, inspiration, to provisioning services like growing your own food and generating clean water and being able to obtain materials. But there's a number of other benefits we derive that we're usually not as cognizant of. And those are the regulating and supporting services where intact nature and green space in cities does things like help sequester excess carbon dioxide, help clean the air, provide pollination services, help generate healthy soils, and contribute to the cycling of excess nutrients. And so the quality of life for people in cities is improved with the expansion of green space. Numerous studies have showed this, from direct benefits to human health, to mental health, to other aspects of well-being and reduced economic costs when it comes to things like storm events and dealing with pollution. Of course, green spaces take many different forms. And so I've been talking a bit about green space and nature in cities as a generic thing, but in reality, there's a lot of diversity in the ways in which nature can appear in cities. And this is something we'll explore in a virtual field trip in a moment. But green spaces and nature in cities falls across a gamut from semi-natural habitats, like remnant habitats, woodlands. Like here in Toronto, we have some great large forest fragments, through to riparian vegetation, all the way to heavily managed parks and home gardens. That's actually my house there. You can see that I have a little bit of a nature bent. But in all these very managed spaces, we tend to see decreases in species diversity. We tend to see decreases in ecosystem function and the services that we're realizing from those. Those tend to be maximized in large, relatively natural spaces. However, in cities, we're also seeing the emergence of a new type of green space, and that is the human-built green space or human-built infrastructure, green infrastructure. And this changes the perception of green from being a different place, some other place you go to experience, some other place where species occur, to a place where humans work and live and have become an integral part of the design. And we see this in Toronto, for example, where we have had a bylaw for the construction of green roofs on new building construction for quite a while now. So we see a lot of green roofs in Toronto. But the best place in the world to really experience this is in Singapore. And so I'm showing a couple of photos here from the Khoo Teck Puat Hospital down here, where you can't tell where the park that surrounds the hospital ends and where the hospital begins. The first couple floors of the hospital are essentially integrated into the park. There's lots of vegetation on different levels of the hospital. The roof of the hospital is a large intensive green roof that's open for gardening. And you have to imagine that the patients who are dealing with illness and recovering in this hospital likely feel a lot better about their health and outcomes given this contact with nature. So as I said, there's a number of different benefits that we can derive from, or that we realize from green space in urban areas. And these vary across a number of different axes, from carbon sequestration to flood production to flood reduction to supporting biodiversity, all the way up to human health. And not all the green spaces contribute equally to these different benefits. So for example, in an urban area, if we're talking about restoring a forest or a wetland, what we're really trying to do is increase carbon sequestration, help flood reduction, maybe reduce urban heat island effect temperatures. But other types of green space might help enhance access to green space or food production or enhance social inclusion. But there's also still a lot that we don't know about the benefits of different types of green space. And so these are areas of very active research. But why do we care? Why do we care about the benefits that we derive from nature in cities? Well, this is the reason why. So as you can see here, this is the Greater Toronto area, and the areas in red are human-built settlements, and the areas in green are natural habitats. And so what you can see from Southern Ontario is that we've almost completely converted the landscape into servicing human population, a very large human population in Toronto. And so in Southern Ontario, more than 90% of the land has been converted. And so the opportunities for people to derive benefits directly from nature is greatly reduced and impacted by human activity. If we zoom in into Toronto proper, what we can see is a couple of things, is that there are a number of small green spaces, these rectangles and squares, which are parks that are scattered throughout the city. And these are meant to provide recreation and relaxation opportunities for human populations. But we also see this really fascinating spider web of ravine areas that go across the city. And we're really fortunate in a city like Toronto to have this extensive and interconnected green space in the city. And it's also by accident. It's not that the early planners of the city had decided to keep the rivers and the riparian areas green and forested. It was because early on, these were the sewers of the city that were exporting industrial and human waste into Lake Ontario. So no one wanted to live and work around those rivers, which were heavily polluted. Then about 60 years ago, Hurricane Hazel came up through the east coast over Toronto and dumped over a meter of rain in 24 hours. It caused massive flooding, resulted in death and destruction. At that time, City Council decided to protect the river areas in order to serve as natural flood relief. And so because of that historical accident, today we have these wonderful green spaces. And so then if you look at this map of Toronto, you realize, oh, there's lots of opportunities for people to derive ecosystem benefits. And so we've done some mapping of the prevalence of support of different ecosystem services and biodiversity. And the areas you see in bright red are areas that disproportionately support biodiversity and provide ecosystem services to human populations. So it looks like we're getting a lot of ecosystem services scattered throughout the city. However, if you look at where the places where people live and where they are directly accessing and benefiting from ecosystem services, you can see that it's highly focused into the core of the city, as you would expect. And so there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of priority areas where we need to think about protecting and expanding green spaces in order that we're improving the well-being and experience of people that live in the city. And so that is just an overview of some of the thinking about the ways in which urban biodiversity and ecosystems exist in cities and why they're important for people. We're going to move on now to Stuart, who's going to talk to us a bit about pedagogical approaches for communicating some of these urban biodiversity and conservation values. But we're going to start off with a virtual excursion, again using Mentimeter, in order to get a sense of your impressions and what you think about different types of green space and some of the ways in which we might want to communicate green space. All right, over to you, Stu.
All right, thanks, Marc. So yeah, we'd like to try a little engagement exercise by taking you on a short virtual field trip through some different types of urban green spaces. And this is definitely from Toronto, but some of you are hopefully in other places, but I think a lot of these will hold true across urban centers. So in this exercise, you'll be viewing some videos of a walk through these different types of spaces, and you'll also be able to hear what they sound like. So make sure your audio is turned up. And we'd like to get a sense of two things here. First, your general impressions of these spaces. And second, your thoughts on their contribution to or importance for biodiversity. So we'll be using, again, a Menti presentation for this, and we'll share the videos through this Zoom call. And then you can, again, enter your responses using menti.com with the code 44643257. And you can either do that again in a separate browser window or on your mobile device, whichever is more convenient. each video of each of these different spaces is 30 seconds long. And then after viewing each one, you'll have 30 seconds to enter some words or short phrases that come to mind for that first question about your first impressions. And then 30 seconds again to do the same for the second question. And when we've gone through them all, we'll go back and take a look back and generate some word clouds from all of your responses so we can see how people experience these virtual spaces, at least for these purposes. So hopefully that sounds like fun. It's a bit of an experiment, but I think it should work out nicely because we have a good group here. Okay, so I'm going to, so Marc, if you can stop sharing there.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, it should be working. Okay, I'll start the timer there. Give you some quiet time to think about it. Well, I think we only got 12%. I'll maybe give you a couple more seconds there, maybe another 10 seconds. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. And we'll do 30 seconds again. Fewer responses here. I wonder if people are a bit unsure about this one. Maybe I'll do an extra 10 seconds just in case. So again, we're thinking about what your thoughts are on the contribution of these spaces to biodiversity conservation. Okay, so that's the first one. So move on to the next space.
Before you leave there, question's not open for voting. Presenter has to open it.
Oh, I think it was, does it still say open now?
I had that message for a little bit and then it opened up for me. But it was
Okay.
Go.
Okay. Okay. Apologies for the technical difficulties here. Okay. Well, we got some responses there, so that'll be a bit shy, but we'll move on to the next one. Hopefully this works out okay. So watch the video here, and I'll maybe just put the countdown for a minute, so it should be a bit more free for you time-wise. Okay. So here's our second space. Okay. So hopefully that's open for everybody now.
Yeah, it looked like 30 seconds was too short a time.
It was too short.
Better return right now.
Okay, so just about to close, then we'll move on to the next question. There we go. Okay. So again, the second is about your, perception of or thoughts on the biodiversity value of these spaces. I'm very curious to see what people will be entering here. I should have put some elevator music in for these sections.
Stuart used to be a professional musician. Maybe you can just play us through. It's hard not to say stuff because I don't want to bias what people are typing in.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next space. So we skipped 3 here in the interest of time, which was probably a good idea. So here we go. Okay.
I like some of the discussion in the chat board about Queen Street, former, it used to be the edge of the city and was polluted.
Yeah, our initial thought with this exercise was to have some images, but we thought, why not go around and do some videos and you hear the spaces? I think it creates a much more immersive experience. Maybe in a year or two, classes can get out in a school bus and actually go to these spaces for something like this. Okay, go on to the biodiversity value. I think I started with, 13 of these videos, Mark, and we whittled it down to 6. Because you can imagine the diversity of types of spaces.
Ariane is suggesting that this would be good for high schools, this type of exercise, which is totally true. Even what you said, Stu, about getting kids on buses at some point. That still takes a lot of effort and time and money. There still might be opportunities for getting classes out into natural spaces using this type of tool.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to see how different age groups respond to something like this, how they experience, younger kids versus high school kids versus university students, I think you'd get some interesting variability there.
Depends if you have a play structure in the park you walk through.
Okay, move on to next one. Oops. Apologies for the ads if you're seeing the ads there. Okay. So we have our fingers crossed that there isn't trolling happening on these this Mentimeter survey, which has apparently been happening a little bit, but fingers crossed. Okay, and I think the next one is we'll do the biodiversity value of the suburban park space, and then we have one more after this, and then we can go back and look at it. Keeping an eye on the time. It's one of the tricky parts. 11:07. Okay, move on. Oh, I think I forgot to start the timer there. I'll just wait a second. Okay, I think that was about a minute. So I'll move on. Oh, there's a few trickling in there. Okay, we'll move on to the last space. If the internet cooperates. Oh, my mistake. There's one more after this. Sorry. Looks like my internet's a bit iffy here.
I don't know why, but I'm really enjoying these videos.
It was fun to go ahead and record them.
For the sake of time, Stu, you could probably skip my storytelling slides later on.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, the Mentimeter is An experiment, definitely. Okay, and then thoughts on biodiversity value.
I'm really enjoying the fact that Jeff Stickney is adding in some really interesting observations and natural history observations and side observations of the different types of spaces.
Mm-hmm. And we can maybe assemble all these videos into a little mini documentary with commentary about them and what people are saying about them. Okay, so I think I'll move on. Oh, there come a bunch last minute there. Okay, I'll move on to the final video. Uh-oh, where'd it go?
The snowstorm.
It disappeared from Menti. Well, we might have to do it at the final video. It's not doesn't appear to be showing up.
We can skip it.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back and look at what people were saying about these places. Okay, here we go. This is fun.
Yeah, I can see some themes that I think most people would. Oh, cold. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
No pigeons.
Striving, I like that.
But basically words that anyone would describe an urban context, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and biodiversity. Low trees. No animal. Void. One type of tree.
Monoculture.
Mm-hmm.
Not diverse. Yeah, that's great. I think most people would agree on those adjectives.
Okay. Oh, lots here. Here we go.
That's really interesting. More diversity equals more diversity of comments.
Mm-hmm.
So we got green, we got relaxing, open, grass, lawn.
Mixed use, invasive.
Bit about cities. So city lights, city noise.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a mix.
Yeah, we see green as most common.
Yeah.
Nice. That's the size is proportional to the number of entries, of course. I should have said that. And then biodiversity value. Oops, sorry. Limited. Overuse sports field. Urban scape. Fresh air. So we do see, see a mix of positive and negative things here.
Mm-hmm. Just green.
Yeah. Let's check out this one here. Ravine path. How are we doing for time here?
We're a quarter after, Stu.
Before I move on, maybe.
Yeah. So much more positive.
Yeah.
Words used.
Should we move on to the next section, maybe?
Yeah, do that.
Yeah. We're tight for so we're tight for time, but I appreciate the responses there. It's the vision here was to get the full spectrum of green spaces in your responses, but because it is an experiment, we weren't quite sure about the timing. So what we'll do now is move back to our presentation.
We should say that Stu and I might write this up in some format. Maybe we can make it accessible to people to see a little bit more about what the results of that exercise were.
Yes. Okay. Here we go. So yeah, we were hoping to get through all that, but didn't know how long it would take to do it. But so we'll try to go through this here, and hopefully we're okay for time. If we're not looking good for time, maybe Ryan can let me know, and we can move ahead for certain things. So I wanted to dig a little bit further into the idea of science communication for urban conservation and the biodiversity that exists in cities. So the main question we're interested in here is, what does the communication of urban biodiversity and conservation consist of? And that's a big question, but at the most basic level, we need to think about the messaging, the audience, and the goals. So the idea of urban biodiversity can be a tricky thing to talk about for a few reasons, because first of all, when we hear the words biodiversity or conservation, it's likely the case that these are the types of places that we think about. These are the places that come to mind, vast areas that have seen little to no development. Of course, that's not always the case, but typically I probably bet on the case that that's what most of us would think about. And these are often protected through legislation as well. And then second, we likely think about these sorts of species, many of which require the persistence of those types of expansive and undisturbed landscapes to support declining population numbers. And of course, conserving these types of spaces and the species within them has huge importance for global conservation goals. But increasingly, we're recognizing that the biodiversity of these more developed spaces is also significant for global conservation, because these environments offer daily opportunities for direct engagement with nature. And so what do we think about, the idea of nature or biodiversity conservation in this type of space? And we got a sense of it from your responses there, or even this type of space. And we saw that, generally people perceived low biodiversity value here, but it's not always the case. There are, maybe a kid, for example, might experience this tree quite differently and feel a lot of value from it, or the birds that are occupying its foliage or something like that. So there is variable, diverse responses to nature in different contexts. And that idea of the variability of nature and how we experience it in urban centers can actually be quite contentious. And part of that definitely boils down to the challenge of defining nature and then understanding how it is manifest in and around cities. So if nature can only be found outside of cities, then we're missing those opportunities to engage with and learn from all of the ecological processes that are occurring in and around cities. And that idea seems to be on the rise in recent years because, again, these are the spaces where we live and interact directly with biodiversity. So one approach that's emerged recently as a means of illustrating the different ways that we interact with biodiversity is the One Health concept. And this can be quite informative for how we communicate about urban biodiversity, where we look at the interaction between the health of the environment, animals, and us. And so obviously there's a lot to talk about here, but we can just think about this in the urban context, where we have these external drivers, things like the rate of urbanization, development plans, population growth, and those feed into how these different elements are manifest in an urban environment. There's the space itself, which Marc talked a lot about and illustrated the heterogeneity there. Oh, we're out of time. Okay. We are very short on time. Okay. Oh my God, this is embarrassing. Yeah. Let me see here. Okay. I'm a little unsure how to proceed here, Marc. You want to?
So Ashley says we can keep it open, but the hosts have to go. Since we're co-hosts, we can keep it open and just finish up the discussion.
Okay. Should I'll jump ahead slides here, maybe?
We could just invite anybody who wants to stay for a few more minutes. If you want to wrap up, they can stay. And if you need to go and to the next session in a few minutes, that's fine too. I can stay for a few more minutes.
Okay. What do you think, Marc? Should we just keep going?
Well, people are saying they would love to hear the rest. I can stay. So Stu, just go with it.
Okay. So apologies for those of you who had to leave. As I said, the Menti thing was an experiment, but, and time-wise, it was a bit tricky. But so we'll keep going. And for those of you that are able to stay, that's fantastic. Okay, so thinking again about this One Health framework here. So we have these different elements of it: human health, animal health, and I think a key element here is that human health part, where that variable interaction that humans feel with both the urban environment or animals in that environment is that we don't necessarily all experience it the same way or have it contribute to a restorative experience where they have that as that dependent variable there. And of course, there's feedbacks that occur in the system as well, where that experience of individuals or groups can feedback on how that urban health or the animal health in that urban center is manifested through time and space. So where does the idea of communication fit in here? Well, again, it's thinking about how an understanding of these different elements and their interaction can inform messaging for different audiences towards different goals. So, digging a little bit more into that. So these are the 4 core elements of a communicative interaction, where we have a communicator who is delivering a message to an addressee with variable objectives. And in many cases, the manner in which a message is delivered can be informed by an understanding of an addressee's predilection to different types of messaging.